once. So we're glad you're here. If you want to share, you joined at the last minute, Katie, what you're excited about as well. I know you said you were joining from DC, which I think means that the cherry blossoms are still out. So I'm sad to miss those this year. I would love to see
Cherry
them.
blossom peak blooms already happened. That was about a
Ah,
week and a half ago.
how was it?
It was pretty. Crowds are wild, so I admired it from my metro train and then went into DC and stayed away from the big crowds that were
No.
down at the tidal basin because they are insane.
Yes, yes. Well, welcome. And if you're able to keep your screen on, that's great. If not, no worries. We're trying to have some of these discussions with each other, and it's awesome if we can have them face to face. However, I realize that sometimes we're in situations where that's not possible. So we're just glad you're here. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those tips and tricks about how we teach, both Gabby, myself, and Nikki, what we teach first, whether it's knowledge of the audience or knowledge of the research. And we're all part of an alliance called Message Mindset. So I think you all registered for this class through this. We work together to share what classes we're doing and also to share tips and tricks about how we teach the interpretive guide and the interpretive host program. I think between all of us, we have taught almost 100 classes. So there's a wealth of knowledge here. And we love to hear, as you're learning, what you're excited about as well. So if you get a chance to look on the website, you can see classes that we do, the interpretive guide, the interpretive host classes, as well as the live events that are happening. We teach individual classes. You'll see some from Kristen Robinson on there about impact storytelling or sensitive topics. And we teach these free train the trainer courses as well. So the next one, just so you know, is going to be May 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And Kristen is going to be talking about unlocking relevance. If any of you have listened to Sam Ham's material, you will have realized that he calls relevance the vitamin R. So, which I love. And when we talk about relevance, I'm sure she'll talk about engagement and enjoyability as well. It's a topic I think we could spend several hours on. But having said that, we're going to talk a little bit more about knowledge of the audience and knowledge of the resource. And so if you've taught a class or if you've looked through the materials, I'm sort of curious where all of you end up. What do you teach, or what would you like to consider teaching first? Would it be knowledge of the audience or knowledge of the resource? You can put that in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute. And there's no right answer here, just so you know. You start with knowledge of the resource. Okay, anyone else? Thanks, John. Resource, you think. Awesome. Thanks, Megan.
For me to say it too.
You start with what? I thought you start with audience, right?
Oh, probably it's better like this. No, I said I'm like waiting for someone to say audience like that. I can answer audience too, and then to not feel.
It's
But I
okay.
start with audience.
You start. I know, thank goodness. So I actually, what about you, Nikki?
Even though I've taught this 25 times, I'm like, I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm gonna have to look it up. You'd think I'd like have my whole thing memorized, but I wrote it down so I didn't have to memorize it. Let me look. I'll find out. I'll put it in the chat.
Well, I can tell you, and I love that Gabby's here because we've taught together. And when we taught our first class, we taught knowledge of the resource first because that's how I teach it. But I think when we teach in June of this year, we're going to teach knowledge of the audience first. So there's no right answer. And I love this question because there's two different viewpoints on what we should teach. And I think it'll bring a fuller understanding of why these subjects are both, for me, equally important. I teach knowledge of the resource first because from my point of view, I feel like starting with the resource, and that includes the mission and the vision and the values of the organization, is fundamental to how we perceive the audience. Understanding where to get your material from, understanding the biases of both yourself and your organization, and the filters that you're going to be looking through materials is going to be important when you think about looking at multiple perspectives, developing counter arguments to the topic that you're talking about, and then looking at ways that sort of what's hot or what's not, ways that you can and techniques that you can use to share this information. So that is why I start with knowledge of the resource. For those that answer, John and Megan, I don't know if you can answer, why do you start with knowledge of the resource? Why is it important for you to start with that? And then I'm going to flip over to knowledge of the audience.
Well, I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
I work for an organization called Earth to Sky, which
Yes.
trains interpreters and tries to put NASA science into their hands. And so our workshops are collaborative in nature, but they always include a fairly strong NASA science component. And we usually lead with that for a number of reasons. One, it kind of gives those high profile presenters like top billing as a, kind of keynote. But I guess maybe I'm stuck in the concept of I feel like it's scaffolding, that lays the foundation for the discussions and the topics that come later. And it doesn't, I mean, I would be open to be doing it other ways, but I think intuitively it just made sense for us to structure it that way. As well as it feels like if it came later on, that would be too late in the process. We usually do 2 or maybe 3 or sometimes even 4-day workshops. And so leading with the science at the onset has always, I think, made sense to me.
Thank you.
Almost in a sense of like, let's get that out of the way.
Interesting.
So that we can dive into this stuff that is maybe a little bit more interesting or relevant into what we do with it,
Yep.
And when it comes to
how much time do you spend on discussing Earth to Sky and NASA as the resource? Do you spend an hour, 2 hours?
Yeah, it depends. If we're doing, we recently did a 3-day workshop and we spent the a whole morning of the first day with a few science presenters. And then we moved into, Yale's Six Americas and knowledge of the audience in the afternoon, kind of. And then we spent the rest of the time on technique and kind of multiple perspectives on the topic.
Thank you. And you mentioned something that I don't think I've heard of before. It's called Yale's Six Americas. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's the Yale program on climate change, and it's just audience research about opinions on the topic amongst the US population. So that's kind of like our bread and butter knowledge of the audience material that we use.
And do you discuss, thank you, do you discuss as well the bias that you represent as an organization, science-based, sort of where you're coming from, what your perspective is, and your share?
Yeah, we do. We try to later on in the workshop address different ways of knowing.
Yeah.
We try to platform artists or creatives or indigenous voices or other folks that, just might bring something new to the conversation.
Yes. That's great. Thank you. I haven't read the Yale Six Americas study. I tend to bring up, I'm going to though. Thank you for sharing that resource. I tend to bring up when we talk about bias, the implicit bias, Project Implicit,
Mm-hmm.
that Harvard brings up, just to think about when we think about knowing the resource, I include that as knowing yourself as part of the resource. So there's your organization, knowing their perspective, knowing what they represent, knowing the vision and the values of who you're part of, and then stepping outside of that, knowing yourself, knowing your own bias, having some self-awareness about how you feel about what the topic is that you're introducing and what your knowledge background is. So I love pairing that with Yale Six Americas and thinking about who you are as a person and who, if you're presenting to a Western culture, who we are as a culture as well, and then bringing in different ways of knowing as well to that perspective. Thank you. So Megan, if you're able to answer, you say knowledge of the resource is the core of the tour experience. That's awesome. What organization do you represent and how many docents do you train? Bruce Moore, Historic House Museum in Cedar Rapids. Awesome. Thank you. 6 docents currently. That's wonderful. So when you're talking about knowledge of the resource, you probably, I would think, have a lot of primary resources that come in, voices that you're bringing in to this historic house museum. How do you layer those with secondary resources, and how do you bring both or different perspectives in when you're talking about knowledge of the resource? Certainly a challenge we have. Great. Well, if there's anything else you want to share, I see that when we talk about and understanding that primary resources do have a bias, they do have a perspective. So if it's possible to bring multiple perspectives into that primary resource, it just makes it a little bit more broad and general when you're talking about a particular topic, especially a sensitive topic. Jennifer, you mentioned I start almost exclusively with primary sources and do chat about who made these primary sources really rich white families. Awesome. How do you have primary resources outside of the white family resource when you're talking about this historic house? And I don't know exactly what it was, who it served, who was part of the community that has made it a museum. It's very interesting to think about. Okay, great. Great, thank you. And Ginger, I see you down there. I don't know if you're able to join us on screen or even unmute. I remember, I think you are in training or about to take the training course as well. If you have anything to share, please feel free to pop in, as well as Jennifer. I know you said you're moving from Iowa to Baraboo. And I'm going to go back and see if you answered resource or audience. But while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to share just my screen quickly to sort of sum up why I think many of us have shared why we teach knowing your resource first. And then I'm going to ask Gabby, tell me a little bit more. And then Nikki, why do you teach knowing your audience first? Or Nikki, if Gabby can't hear, I'll pass it over to you while we're waiting for Gabby.
Oh yes, no, it was just I was reading your slide. It is very good. Of course, first of all, I think this is something that we can interchange. I've taught also a course where I remember I taught first the resource and after the audience, but that was because one of my co-trainers it needed to be there that day. So that's why we're just, but it was not really something that we thought. But it's true that the way that we teach resource first and audience after, or audience and then resource, in teaching is not as complicated as when the application, the actual application, when the student asks, yes, but what I do first. And there is also when I feel it's interesting to explain a little bit, okay, so what do you do first? When I think about the audience, I think that equips us with the knowledge that we need to use, adapt, or select the resources accordingly and more effectively. And effectively. So when we understand the characteristics, the needs, the backgrounds, the preference, the limitation of the audience, then we can see, or we can decide about the relevance of the resource. So for when I'm teaching, for answering that question, I'm thinking at the same time, as you can see, I'm like processing it. What do I do first? I think that there is two different kinds of interpreters. The one that is working on site, that is probably very knowledgeable about the resource already. And the one that is probably not, and you have to make a entire research about the resource first. So then I will think, okay, probably you are already acquainted with your resource so well that you probably can go and learn about your audience first. And then with all of what you already know, then you can adapt. But I think that when you're not probably on site and then you need to collect all of these pieces of information, it's something that I encourage the students, the interpreters to do this as much as possible, to collect the information every single time that is possible. If you have a chance to interview someone, like when we talk about the primary resources, the secondary resources, like the direct observations, all of this is something that is supposed to be continuous, a continued practice, that you do this every time. But then learning about the audience is also, it depends. It's complicated, right? I hope you can follow me with my Franglish. When you're working on site, again, you have chances to go and see the records, the audience records, and to understand who are the kind of visitors that comes to the site. But if you are a tourist guide, for example, you do not really have the same opportunity to go and if you're a freelance, to go and see all of these records. So there is two different perspective here. What do you do?
Yeah, and I love how you're sort of weaving that audience into the resource, because we rely on the resource to get the audience data. We rely on our organization's information, that sort of any analytics that are coming through to get data about the audience. So in many ways, they're inextricably linked, audience and resource.
Yes, exactly.
Nikki, what about you?
I think I train people in 3-hour chunks. That's broken up to hour and a half, with a break in between. So I think really I started with the audience probably because it fit that time chunk. I also really stress how interpretation is audience centric. So to me, I think it naturally went, and I've been hearing the great argument for KR seems to naturally be the first step, but for me, I think that audience is the first step. Is that if we're not relating to the audience, then because at every one of our places, there's so many different things we can talk about. I was just thinking about this International Crane Foundation, and obviously going to talk about cranes and the habitat, but also there's a history. There's the our European ancestry history, but then there's also the land before that history. I mean, so every place has these layers and layers of what we can talk about, even just whether it's history or culture or nature. I think every place out there has those three pieces in it, embedded in it. And so there's so many topics you can talk about. So if we think about who our audience is first, then that kind of helps to put it in perspective of, I want to reach school kids. Oh, this is going to be boring for school kids. How can I make that boring thing exciting? Or this is what the school kids really want time and time again. Or this is what international visitors really want time and time again. Or I would like to lead this when when that phenomenon is not going on. What kind of things, who are the people who are coming at that time when there's nobody around? So to me, it seemed natural to start with the audience and go, interpretation is audience centric. Everything you do after that is secondary to the idea of audience.
I like
But
that.
it all made a really good case about the KR first. Maybe I'll change up my whole.
I think I love what you're saying, because I think they're intertwined, and a lot of that data that you're getting about your audience is coming from the resource, right? It's coming from the organization that you represent as well. So I feel like it's very iterative, whether you cover audience or resource first, you're going back to getting information from the resource, or you're getting information from the audience about the resource that you represent. So I'm going to read what Katie says. I trained docents. The previous methods for the docents program when I started was teaching the resource and then a 1-hour presentation at the end for knowledge of the audience. I'm switching, so we start with learning the audience, then going into resource. Katie, are you able to tell us a little bit about more why you switched?
So, hi everybody. I'm at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. / Chantilly, Virginia. So we have 2 locations. So it gets
Yes.
confusing. But being at the Smithsonian, people go to DC. We are the expectation. You go to the Air and Space Museum, you go and see the 1903 Wright Flyer, or you go to the Udvar Hazy Center, you go see the Space Shuttle and the Blackbird. We have that. We are in the guidebook. People have that expectation. But then you have the air and space buffs. You have the people who their grown-ups are dragging them there and they don't really care. We're next to 2 airports. I need to kill a couple hours before my flight. Or
Yes.
Our Udvar Hazy Center is on airport, right next to the airport. So we have plenty of people who come because their flight got delayed by 6 hours. We have the mega bus groups bringing them in. We have so many different reasons why people come in, the different dynamics, and that is understanding that is really important to what you need to provide for that visitor. And it's one of these things we all want to roll our eyes when we see the bus of teenagers, and we want to stereotype them as they're going to be goofing off and just on their phones. But how can we meet their needs so they do engage and they're not just on their phones?
Right. And then have specific and a depth of knowledge on a particular airplane or shuttle that goes beyond maybe even what the docent knows.
Exactly. And it's one of these things where I love my docents, but the previous method, honestly, was just the knowledge dump, where it's just so much 3-hour tour. And we know from Gilligan's Island, that's a dangerous amount. But it's just like less is more. People are on a time crunch. They don't want FOMO. You need to be able to give those highlights within an hour so that when they come back home and go, I went to the Air and Space Museum. Well, did you see the space shuttle? No, we didn't have time to get to that. I had to drop out. They don't have that FOMO.
I love that. So tell me, do you give your docents a specific set of questions when people are going in that sort of will allow that tour to be somewhat curated for the audience that's in front of them?
So we're currently restructuring it and working on how we're going to implement the new docent class later this year. But yeah, a lot of it is pulling back of you do not need to tell everything. And that's been one of the things is with the new training, we will be making the current docents take this training of interpretation. We've already started with the DC location of interpretation, you do need to think about how can we engage the audience? How can we connect them to the objects? It's not just you talking incessantly for hours upon hours.
It's a dialogue, right? It's a
It is.
conversation.
It's a new approach. They're used to just being heard and not listening. So that that exchange of communication is a new approach we're trying. But I mean, there's so many we've gotten so many great visitor compliments of, oh, they love that they brought this up. I love that we got to talk about this.
That's great. So you have it sounds like a really good foundation to sort of restructure this and
Yeah.
reimagine.
And I have about 200 docents between the two locations. So
And how do you anticipate a soft landing with sort of changing that format to more conversational and curated to who's in front of you? How do you imagine that section of your training?
well, that's why teaching the audience first, because why we need to have that flexibility is because we have so many different types of audiences. You know, there are going to be a couple key elements of, yes, for the Udvar-Hazy Center, you have to talk about these big 5 objects, but how can we be flexible? How can we meet the need? I'm trying to reduce the amount of structure when I first walked in that was a lot. I cut half of it off, honestly, of
Well,
making work. Yes.
I love what you're saying about keeping it simple.
Yeah.
And even thinking about having like an FAQs, here's the top 10 FAQs for our site. So these, you know, are ones that you most likely will be asked. And then these are some universals when we think about our site that relate to our audiences in front of us, whether it's freedom, survival, exploration, sort of what those keywords that you could key into for who's showing up, what you would find out about that.
And I know with our docents, I mean, they come from different backgrounds and they get really passionate about certain things. Maybe they were a pilot for 20 years or they were a flight attendant and, you know, they were part of that civil rights movement to, you know, for better equality for women in that field. I mean, there are so many of these things where they are passionate about it. They have the life experience. And that's why I want it to be more flexible, where they can really shine on those passionate topics they have. So that's why I have very limited structure for, like, yes, you have to talk about the big 5, but you can interpret, you know, with more of what, you know, with some items that you really are passionate about. And that really, people love it when you get really passionate. Nobody wants to listen to the Bueller.
I just saw that Lewis Hamilton, the F1 Formula race car driver, did I guess a short with Ferris Bueller's Day Off, inserted himself into part of a little short. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm very interested in seeing that. That's a total rabbit trail. I'm so curious, how are the data analytics for your site, Katie? And are you able to sort of say, we know that on a summer day, on Tuesday, during the morning, this is who typically shows up? Do you have some understanding of who your audiences are at different times of the year, different seasons, and for different amounts of time?
It depends. So we have sensors at our doors that do the visitor count. So we know hourly how many people are coming in versus going out. Our downtown location's under construction, so we require free time passes. So in that, they do ask, you know, your age range, where you're, you know, your zip code, just so we can get to know where people are from. We did have to reduce who you're visiting with because it was just too much of a form. But we have in the past, Smithsonian Wide did in 2018 a massive study exploring what groups were coming to which museum for what reason and from where. So it was definitely way pre-COVID, but that is something that what we have used to help understand our visitors. And then the time passes, we do glean a lot of information just where they're coming from.
And then just the questions that people ask when they show up, just having those set of questions so you know if there's somebody that has a layover or if they're part of a bus tour or they're an international group, typically what people want to see from different groups that are showing up, I think might be interesting as far as connecting with your docents and knowing what information or places they might want to go, and then understanding like that part of John Falk's audience motivations. If people are there as facilitators, as as explorers, as rechargers, sort of getting the resources in hand to your docents to support those groups that are coming in, I think is really important as
Yeah.
well. Do you ever have school groups, or is it all
All the time.
all the time? That's awesome.
Oh yeah, March
That's
is when all the field trips start and the buses begin. I think last week when I was at Hazy, there was 6 buses before we even opened, like charter buses.
That's
And they
great.
didn't stop for 3 hours. There's just a nonstop stream of kids coming in.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for
It's
sharing.
good for you. I'm the one going, swimming upstream through a crowd of teenagers. That's the scary part.
I love that. I'm going to put this up. These were the reasons why I thought people might put knowing your audience first. I think I've covered some of them, or you've covered some of them, maybe not all of them. With that, I'm just going to let you take a look at this. Gabby, what would you like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading this. Yes, of course. I think if so my solution oh, sorry, let me just lower my hand. My solution, or the solution I use for when they're asking about what to do first, I try to encourage that thinking about the audience first. I said, okay, so what is that question that I would like, oh, sorry, they print and in front of them, or they remember, is what does my audience need to hear? Or what my audience need? What is my audience motivation? Oh, I wanted they think about the audience first. So that's why I think is important for me to, once I understand the audience, then I can go and talk about the research, because since we are developing an actual presentation, so then when I see what is the information that they gathering, or what is the information that they want to start searching, then I would like to see if, I mean, you're telling me that your audience are 5 years old. So, and then you're going to go and you're searching in places where probably this is not appropriate is in French, appropriate, I guess. Thank you. So I think I want to really reinforce that way of thinking. And there is another part, I remember, I always get confused with these words, because it's when I explain the difference between audience-based program, right, or program-based audience. So what is the difference? And also, I think in that way they can see that if they think about the audience first, it is really important for them that they choose what is the resources. But something that is interesting is, like, I teach the mission of the organization, the mission and the vision and all of that when I'm teaching the P in purpose. I don't know if it's the same for you. Yeah, I don't teach anything of the mission of the organization during the knowledge of the resource. For me, the resource is exclusively what I am talking about. So then when I'm teaching the P is when I go and see, okay, what is the purpose of what I am talking about? Then I go and revise the organization. Maybe, but then, yeah. Sorry,
I teach it in the resource, and then because it's such an iterative curriculum, I teach it again with P. I was going to refer to this slide. I use it both in person and online, but I feel like this principle of Cable and Beck, when we're teaching purpose and programs, principle 12, where it says the overall interpretive program must be capable of attracting support, and whatever that support is for your organization, whether it's financial, volunteer, political, administrative, or something beyond that, whatever support is needed, considering how the program you're developing, based on the hierarchy of needs for your organization, how it fits in with there, if it does, if it's able to. I've thought a lot about what I was listening to Tim Merriman's podcast a while back, and income generation is also part of what I teach. I love that. Tim Merriman has a podcast called Talking Story, and one of the earliest episodes, he shared his experience. I believe it was in Indiana when he was part of a 70-person interpretive program where, because of budget cuts, I believe, or maybe 77 and 73 people got cut, and he was one of the 4 people that remained, something along those numbers. And it's because his programs had relevance not only to the audience, but they were also relevant to the mission of the organization. And they saw that. And so whether that holds true today in this world, in this time, I'm not so sure, but I do think it's worth thinking about whether you cover mission, vision, and values in the P, whether you cover it in knowledge of the resource, or you talk about it in relationship to the audience. It's really considering the information that we give our docents, how that is, how you're responding to the needs of the organization you represent as well. So Nikki, I don't know, we've got just about 5 more minutes. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about income generation, or I can go to the next question. It's totally up to you.
No, that was totally it. That story about Tim Merriman is just wonderful, in that a lot of us interpreters don't feel that income generation is part of, because we're thinking like this gift shop. Well, in some places, the gift shop is what keeps the whole place afloat, or the tours are keeping the whole place afloat, or the school tour program is what keeps the whole thing afloat, or whatever. But there's also other places, county parks, state parks, and federal. We need to vote for those places as well, to keep them going. And or even if we get this extra tax on international visitors that are coming, maybe we want to say thank you for our international visitors. You're the one that you are also really helping us. Some way that we can bring people in. But to recognize that, I think, is really important, not just for our own jobs, but that's how that place flourishes. So if they were able to hire you instead of using a volunteer, or hopefully in addition to using volunteers, that's what takes it further. And I know it seems like some sort of greedy cop out or something, but it's not. It's a reality of what we have, especially for nonprofits.
Thank you. Yes. And I think it's really interesting because sometimes in a mission statement, it doesn't necessarily say what the goal might be for that organization. And I think it would be really interesting to have our outlines when we do our CIG outlines, to think about what might be our organization's main goal when we're looking at someone's program outline, and if this program is actually help meeting that goal, or one of the top 3 goals of an organization. Where does this program fit in? Because when I'm looking at someone's outline, I'm looking at the mission statement, I'm looking at the theme statement, I'm looking at the goals, the objectives, and the measurement, and I'm making sure, do these all align or not? And how does this align with the program you're doing? So if I were to add, and if doing my own program, I would say what's 1 to 3 of the top goals of your organization, and explain how this is meeting that goal. I think that's really important. Katie, Ginger, Jennifer, John, or Megan, is there anything you want to share as well? How do you, what's important to your organization when you think about interpretation? Or to your organization continuing to exist? What's most important? Is it financial, volunteer, political, income generation? What's most important to your organization?
Yeah, this is a tough one. That principle really puts you a little bit at a rock and a hard place sometimes, of having to justify what you're doing. Our work is certainly political, and we work across partners. So I work for an organization, and our primary audience is a different federal agency. And so we have to have buy-in, not only that what we're doing is important to our agency, but that our audience, also finds it worthwhile and supporting their goals. And especially right now.
Yeah.
That's a tricky proposition.
Yeah, thank you. And if you have any thoughts, how do the programs that you do now currently support that? Or where do you see that being supported in what you do now? And you don't have to answer, it can be rhetorical. I'll just say
Yeah,
the Monstera in your background, which I'm totally
I
enjoying.
know. Yeah, so it's my favorite. Um, I think that's a good question for us to be continually asking ourselves. I mean, in one way, the justification for our programs is very much aligned with the goals of our organization as well as the goals of our partner organizations, although those goals change and
Yes. Yeah.
those goals are not necessarily immune to politics,
Yes.
right? And so,
So for
that
you, that might be sort of a
it's a
moving,
moving target a little bit.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a target, but just more, keeping your eye on the ball, like sort of seeing where it's going back and forth.
Yeah, I think we're definitely at that point now where we are, do we need to pivot significantly?
Yeah.
And if so, what does that look like? And how do we serve people with what their needs are right now?
Well, making sure you're aware, here's why we exist and here's how we exist and here's how we hope to exist in the future with your help and support.
Hmm.
I see that Megan put for the tour program, I see the most important thing is building stakeholders. And I guess that would be, is there a call to action? Is there some way when you're having these tours that people can become involved? And how can they access that information? Do your docents have that information as well? Do they understand that that's a really important part of what you do and how you exist? And you put, even if tour guests don't remember every single thing they heard or learned on the tour, if they enjoyed themselves and found value, they're more likely to donate to our organization. Are there mechanisms for them to do that? Are they given those on the tour and be an advocate for organization, right? That's that they're hitting that self-actualization moment when you have people that want to advocate for you after being part of a tour or part of a conversation with you. So how do we weave those into the conversations we're having? How do we help our docents weave that into the conversation and take the next step? And Katie, what would that mean for you with the existence, the existential part of what you do and how you continue to exist?
Well, overall, the Smithsonian's goal is the increase and diffusion of knowledge of mankind. Thank you, Jane Smithson, for putting that in your will. We have yes. So that is our overarching goal. So, educating, inspiring those in air and space for our museum specifically. We are currently figuring out which direction we are going, just among everything currently DC. So we are waiting for leadership to disseminate decisions that have been made, and we will follow what they say. But I mean, our goal is to educate and inspire and help, everyone learn how complicated and amazing all the people within aviation and space history are. Through triumph, struggle, it was not, just a simple path of, oh, and we got it. There were so many people who had different types of struggles and hardships and how they made a really big impact.
I love that. Well, how do you evaluate with your docents, or do they do any type of evaluation if you're meeting that goal or meeting that mission? What do you do?
We've not had the staffing to do full scale evaluation. We have had it where I love Avery business cards where you can print out multiple business cards and we will have our docents hand out, would you please evaluate my tour so that we can, accumulate data and kind of have a baseline of what are people wanting, what did they like, what did they not like. That's how we were able to convince them that 3-hour tours were not people don't want 3-hour tours.
They're telling us, they're actually telling us that
Yes.
yes. How do you
We have
keep,
the data to prove it. No more 3-hour tours.
I like that. I think, and letting the data show and not you telling is such a powerful tool, I think,
It is.
in the hands of people.
Yeah. And then also, being federal, we are, myself as well as my volunteers, they are not allowed to accept tips. So very much do not accept that money. You can point them at the rocket ship they can put their dollar in, or here's the blue card that has our visitor service email address. Pay us with compliments. I brag to my bosses and to you,
I like
which
that.
then helps, all these, great emails saying, oh, this tour was amazing. They were so great. I'm able to then advocate on behalf of the docent program to my bosses and then, senior leadership to say, look at what great work I do. You should give me more funding or more resources.
I like
Always
that.
cool.
Well, it's definitely worth thinking about in this day and age, the programs that we do, even if it's roving interpretation, what having the knowledge of the resource of what's most important to your organization in order for it to be sustainable and continue to exist. But also, I think as Gabby, Nikki, and you so well pointed out, why it's important to understand your audiences as well. I think they're both interlinked. And what I do, again, I've said this, what I love about teaching the CIG is because you can't teach one without the other. And when you're teaching about the resource, you're looking at the audience as well. If you've ever done that page, what's hot and what's not, in knowledge of the resource, that's an audience in and of itself, because it's thinking about the techniques that might appeal to your audience specifically, whether it be an inspirational quote, a story talking about your organization's accomplishments, or that insider's tour and information. That's embedded in the resource, the thinking about your audience. And likewise, you're considering your resource as well when you look at CIG, because you're looking at visitor analytics, you're looking at who's showing up, you're thinking about the questions you're asking as well from an organizational standpoint. So Gabby says, I'm thinking of renaming the module to previous knowledge and then introducing both knowledge of the audience and knowledge of the resource. I'll highlight how both are important and how they naturally blend in the real world. Yes, well said. And I love that you talked again about bringing up that mission, because it's NP for purpose, having it there as well. Because if we look at these programs when they're done, these 10-minute presentations, or even the programs that we have, if we're not considering who we represent and what we're doing, then it may or may not remain as part of how we exist. So we are at time, folks. This is just meant to be a discussion to think about ways that we can train better, do better, and learn together. I want to thank you all for joining us. We're going to stick around for questions, but before I do that, I would really encourage you, these are going to be free sessions. I would encourage you to show up next month. Kristen Robinson, who's an amazing storyteller and who's worked very much on talking about relevance. This is a subject that she's done a deep dive in. We'll lead a discussion just like we did today and also share why unlocking relevance is important. So thank you all for joining us. Again, we'll stick around. I really appreciate you being here. And if you have any questions, let us know. Bye, everyone.